You're about to listen to the Complete Developer Podcast, the podcast by coders, for coders, about all aspects of life as a developer.
I'm Will, the curmudgeonly experienced developer.
And I'm Beej, the optimistic newbie developer.
Complete Developer Podcast is supported by listeners like you. We are now on Patreon at www.patreon.com/Complete Developer Podcast.
Welcome to another episode, and may the 4th be with you. We're finishing our discussion on code smells that we began last week. And these are quick ways to tell what areas of your code need to be refactored. But before we get started, Will, what have you been fighting this week?
Well, this last week, I spent it in Vegas.
Nice.
Yeah. So I was at MicroConf, and there were a whole lot of software developers there, including a few new listeners. And, a few people that we've had on the podcast. I talked to Josh Duty, met him. Talked to John Sonmez. That was pretty good. And then I got to climb a mountain in the Vegas area desert, which was Turtlehead Peak off of Red Rock. And it was supposed to be strenuous. And strenuous here in Tennessee means that it's steep and there might be some climbing, but it's not real bad. You're not going to slide much unless it's muddy. Over there, it means that you're going to slide, period. Got to the top without too much trouble, but the way back down was mostly on all fours, or a good bit of it, which was not very helpful. I didn't have appropriate shoes. It's, shale scree, basically, and it was just dangerous.
Yeah.
Took a very long time to get back down, but made it, flew back in Saturday night and just kind of chilled out. So that's pretty much all I've got. I mean, I've got like 15 pages of notes from the conference, but had a good time. So how about you?
Well, I have been fighting with MVC controllers in .NET, trying to return JSON in camel case, because the JSON converter that converts an object to a JSON result doesn't allow you to change the settings for casings.
And you're not using Newtonsoft?
That was the Newtonsoft. It's the JSON results converter. So I had to just
return a string.
Yeah, so I had to do a content result. But in the instructions I found on how to set that up, it had you set content equal to whatever your object is. So the result was an object with one parameter, content, that contained the object you wanted to send.
Well, that's not very helpful.
Yeah, I hacked a way around it, and it worked. Then when I realized, I have to present this code this week, I really should find a better way of doing it. I realized that I was the one that was setting the parameter content when I was creating the content result. And I could just put the object in, and it would create the object.
Oh.
It was a bad tutorial that I found, so, bad tutorial, no donut.
Yeah, sometimes you get burned. I got burned today because for whatever reason, I had a knockout model, that was basically, pulling data out of it.
Yeah.
And somehow I shoved a function in there instead of a variable, instead of a Boolean.
Oh, man.
And so it's coming back and you go, hey, if this thing, because I'm thinking it's Boolean and we're in JavaScript land, so it's truthy because it's non-null because it's a function. Mm-hmm. Even though if you'd evaluated it, it would have been null, but it would have been false.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was not happy.
Oh, yeah. Well, what I find really crazy is sometimes I would try to put something in there and it would instead send back like the object model. So I'm like, that's not what I need. I don't need like the name of it in my code. I need...
Oh, yeah. We try to string it.
Yeah. So, well, Easter was this past Sunday, and I drove down to Florida to spend it with my sister and her family. We spent most of the time setting up for a really big egg hunt they had on Saturday. And even as an outgoing and extroverted person, after a long drive and then spending 2 days setting up, I really wasn't up for socializing. And there were probably over 200 people there, and that's just too many people when you don't know anyone, and you're probably never going to see them again.
Yeah.
Though I did have a lot of fun with my nieces. We played a lot of games and put candy in plastic eggs for the hunt, all that stuff. My sister rented one of those big bouncy houses with a slide for the egg hunt. And before and after, my nieces and I got in and played and jumped around and stuff. It was a lot of fun. They even taught me their secret handshake.
Oh, wow.
And I feel very special.
You're part of the tribe now.
Yes.
It's just like Return of the Jedi. pretty much.
Yes, yeah. I feel special, and so I have something special for kids this week for IoTs. So let's go ahead and roll the music. This week for IoTs, I have sort of a product or group of products called Tinkerkit. And Tinkerkit is a tool based on the Arduino that simplifies the process of making interactive products. It's a platform designed for education and kind of simplifies the programming of an Arduino. There's no need for advanced knowledge of physics or engineering. Kids and hobbyists can get in and start playing around with pre-assembled sensors and actuators. I'll have a link to that in the show notes. Who's talking to us this week?
Well, we grabbed a comment on the website, and yes, we did get comments fixed finally from Jamie. It says, "Hey guys, great podcast. I've been listening for a while. I just wanted to say that I really appreciated the advice that you guys had for dealing with imposter syndrome. I really liked the what do you call a doctor who gets a C average. From my own experiences with imposter syndrome, I can advocate for taking some time out from the issue you're facing and think about something else. Taking a walk around the building or outside can really help. I think it's related to allowing your subconscious to deal with a problem rather than the conscious. I can't tell you the number of times I've been walking around doing something mundane, topping off my coffee, going for a walk, taking a bathroom break, when I suddenly figure out the solution. Either that or go and do something easy for a quick morale boost. I keep a list of easy tasks by my keyboard, from changing the style of this heading to write this missing unit test, etc. Completing something small and easy can really boost your morale. The other thing I found that helped was have a colleague or friend give you a boost. I was at a 24-hour hackathon recently, and around hour 20, I started to doubt myself. I couldn't get something to work and turned to one of the guys on my team, told him I didn't think I was contributing to the team. I can't repeat exactly what he said, but the censored version would be, "Stop being an idiot. Look what we've done so far. You can do this," which echoes, "Jump before you are ready to leap."
Well, hey, thanks, Jamie. This kind of reminds me of a time that I'd gotten stuck, and I wrote some code that smelled the moment I wrote it, but was the only solution I had at the time. And so I got it working, went home for the day. And the next morning, I was still upset about not being able to solve the problem in a better way. And on the drive in, I had a thought about how to fix it. As soon as I got to my desk, I tried it, and it worked. And, you're right. Sometimes if you're stuck and even rubber ducking or asking questions doesn't help, getting away from the problem puts it in a different perspective. So we've got a Complete Developer water bottle just for you. Send us an email to neckbeards@completedeveloperpodcast.com with your information, and we'll get that sent out to you. And guys, if you'd like your very own Complete Developer water bottle, leave us a review on iTunes or comment on the website or any of our social media. We post all of our episodes to Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and Google+. We're also on Path and Tumblr. Guys, the day has come to finally announce the winner of the iTunes review contest. You will be getting an autographed copy of either one of Bethany Adams' books, and the winner is John Beluga. Thanks a lot, John, for your review, and thanks to everyone that entered the contest and for all the awesome reviews in iTunes that we received. We really do appreciate those. So, code smells are patterns that are quick and easy to identify as areas in your code that may need to be refactored. These are high-level signs that point you to areas where you can then take a closer look at your code. However, just because you notice a smell doesn't mean you must refactor. It just means you know where to look for potential bad code. We originally recorded this as one long episode, but there was enough material that in post-production we split it into 2 episodes so that we'd be able to include everything. AKA, we've refactored. And depending on who you ask or where you look, there's lots of different code smells, from general to paradigm-specific to even language and framework-specific smells. In part 1, we discussed code smells related to class structure and the architecture of your code. In this episode, we'll discuss smells that are related to the actual code itself, with naming, unnecessary, and bloated code. The next group of code smells is arose by any other name, or poor or uninformative naming. Naming conventions are going to vary depending on your language, framework, or even the coding standards where you work.
Yeah, or even the person implementing it in many cases.
Well, that's where it becomes a problem.
Yeah.
There are a few smells that kind of can alert you to potential technical debt if not corrected. And these typically have to do with too much or too little information in the name.
Yes.
So the first one is type embedded in the name.
Oh, yeah. And this is a pet peeve of mine because I started out with Visual Basic, right?
Okay.
Like back in the day. They had this thing called Hungarian notation, which I don't know why they dislike Hungarians enough to pin that on them. But it was basically like if you have an integer, you start the name of the thing with I. Right?
Yes.
Oh, but you also have scope information. So it's like it's module level, which is kind of like your class level, but not quite. It'd be M_I, whatever the thing's name is.
Well, back...
Oh, and if it's an array, you put the word array in there too.
Back in high school, when we were doing like QBasic or Pascal procedural languages, stuff like that kind of made sense because you could look at the name and tell where it was and stuff.
Right.
But with the
modern tools, it's not.
Yeah, with modern tools, it's completely unnecessary. It makes it more difficult because it's basically a redundant naming convention.
Yeah. Well, the other thing too is what happens when you change the scope or you change the type?
Yeah.
You either have to change every occurrence of that thing or you now have a lie. Now, the only place I will use it is typically, like if it's a WinForms app or something like that, you don't really want to do this on the web unless there's very few circumstances where you do it on the web, but for control types. So like if I have a label that's for, first name, it'll be LBL first name. And if I have a text box that's TXT first name. And then,
I gotcha.
And what's nice about that is these are environments where you don't have things like CSS. Mm-hmm. And so I can say, well, grab all the label controls in the form because all the controls that start with LBL and apply this thing to them.
Yeah, I got you.
Because it's sort of like a ghetto style sheet. That's a place that will work.
Another place that I've used this, or another place that I've done this, I wouldn't say use this, but I've done this is with dates because a lot of times the naming conventions for what the product owner wants is this field, the name of that field, date, for the date that it was entered.
Yeah, and that makes sense. I'll tell you another place I use it. I'll actually kind of bend this rule is in JavaScript code if I'm using jQuery.
Yeah.
Right, because I'm referring to an element and I want to know that, hey, this is a jQuery object. Because again, I'm in JavaScript, so I don't have like the strong typing information, but it really matters. Yeah. Because I don't know if I'm applying this to one thing or to a bunch of things and the calling conventions are different. Yeah. And so I'll start it with a $sign.
And again, this is where that is actually useful.
Yeah. But in most modern languages, in a modern environment, you shouldn't be doing that.
It adds complexity.
Yeah. When you could look at it this way, if you can hover over it with a cursor and it tells you what it is because the IDE knows what's going on, you probably can drop this.
Basically, you should name your methods based on what they do, not what they produce or what they take in.
Right. So you don't call it get the thing.
Yeah.
It might be get the thing by ID.
Yes.
In some cases, but it's not just random, get the thing and, here it takes so long.
Yeah.
Well,
I have written methods that were search by first name, search by middle name, search by last name so that...
Yeah.
But I mean, that again, it tells you what it does. And telling you what it does is part of what it takes in.
Yeah, the bigger thing is no coding standard is perfect or correct. Yeah. It's that you just got to have something where people can actually tell what they're looking at.
Mm-hmm. The next is uninformative naming. Method names that do not describe what the method does. And, I was listening to an older episode where you mentioned something that I think I had told you I did in high school, which was name my methods and variables so that the code told a story.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I've been through a few of those. I had one that was like, create the entity class because people are stupid. Because it was I had like this ball of spaghetti code that was calling into one of my methods, and I couldn't trace everything back, because some of it was like store stuff in session state, and then this other page is going to get it out and put something else in there, a different type in the same session state field, and then you get it back. Really? Yes.
Oh my!
And so I had a method that was called that would basically take all this and go, okay, how did they screw this up and like sort it so that it's so that I can make the rest of the code downstream not a dumpster fire? Because
I follow you there. Yeah,
I couldn't. I had to fix it. I had to make a seam right there. There's just no other way. And that was a descriptive method name. Now it got truncated because somebody found it offensive.
Well, that always happens.
Yeah, it was like do the thing instead of do the thing because people are stupid. But stuff happens.
Well, I've told you. I've told you, Will, but I don't know if I've mentioned it on the show or not, but y'all have met Cody that I work with. He's a lead front-end developer. On the front end, several of us have started, instead of using to do, we have Cody says as sort of a joke. I mean, I put in my code to do, like the at the top, like a comment, to do, replace Cody says with to do.
Yeah.
But, it's kind of funny. The thing about this is other developers should be able to read the method names and have a general idea of what the method does.
Yeah, and the other thing is they shouldn't really know who wrote it most of the time. You should try to match your team's style and structure and all that stuff. Part of this, too, is like if the code looks like it belongs there, nobody's going to call it out as the problem when something breaks and then point the finger at you.
Well, yeah. Well, I will be honest. When I started, there was already an API developer working on the project, and it was like the second one that was coming in as like the liaison between the UI and the API because I full stack. And she had a naming convention that I did not like at all, and I am not using on the app that I am the primary API developer now. But that was already established.
Yeah, so you just stick with it so nobody gets confused. Because, it just makes it easier. Now, I worked at a company that had a naming convention that I despised. I hated it. Because if you have a scalar value or you have, when you have one instance of something, right? Yeah. It had to start with one whatever or a whatever. And I'm like, okay, now I can't change the type. I can't change it to a list and do, it's just, But I stuck with it. We actually had a resharper like style thing that would go through and fix that for us. Like the guy wrote this thing, so you could just run it over a set of code and clean that up.
That's pretty sweet.
It was great because I could write the code like I wanted it and and say clean up.
Very nice. And that really gets to the way to fix this, which is rename or rewrite your methods to quickly convey the functionality of the method in the name.
Yeah.
Finally, under this is inconsistent naming. This is naming that does not match throughout the app. And we just talked about this. This is switching the naming convention throughout the code.
And you see this in lava flow patterns too, where somebody did it one way and then the next crop of developers came in. This is like the app I'm working on right now. Yeah. And they said, oh, this sucks. We can't fix it all, but we're going to just fix our parts. Fix some of this. And then there's another layer of developers. And so you have to start getting in the headspace when you're working.
I haven't seen that at work because I've done all new development there, but I've seen that in some of the open source stuff that I've made contributions to.
Yeah. Or you see it in old line of business apps.
Yeah.
And you're like, okay, who
I'm
wrote
expecting to see that. I've heard about that in some of the legacy stuff that we have. And so in the next few weeks, I'll be seeing that. Actually, I mentioned just a moment ago the other API developer. She had a thing about, and I did not like this, but when she was writing unit tests, she would write her tests, can I do whatever?
Okay.
Which is fine. I'm okay with that. But then half the times the test would say, I can do whatever. And finally, I got fed up with it. I'm like, I don't understand what's
the difference there? Yeah.
And so I asked her, she's like, oh, well, once it's passed, I change the name to I can. I'm like, why do you do that?
Oh, yeah. Wow. And that does bring up an interesting thing with unit tests, because if you have a name that's structured that way, you can write a tool that runs in unit, for instance, and gets dumps out all the tests and their results. Yes. And can actually parse it into human readable text from the names.
Yeah, I do that.
And you'll see that with behavior driven development frameworks too.
Within unit and a couple others, you can also set it to one thing I found really useful is that with several of the testing frameworks in the Microsoft suite, you can set it in your XML config to show you the SQL that it produces. Like if you're using in Hibernate or Entity Framework or ORM, you can show the SQL that it's producing that's sending out through the test. And then you can also make that legible. So it's not like just one long line of SQL.
Yeah.
It'll actually break it down into where you can read it. I cannot tell you how many times that has saved my butt because our DBA was like, well, I don't understand why this isn't working. Can you show me with a SQL you're using? And I'm like, yes, I can. And I send him that. And he's like, oh, I see where the problem is. I'll fix it.
Yeah.
And, it's not like a...
Yeah, well, I mean, you do have to bear in mind, human beings, we have to beat the drum with developers to go, hey, you got to realize the computer's not the only one reading it, but you also have to realize human beings aren't the only one reading it too. And if you make things consistent, you can do automated stuff.
Yes.
That makes life nicer.
Basically, what this is getting at is just pick a standard of terminology and stick with it. If working on legacy code, look for the standard or at least the most commonly used standard.
Yeah, and I always ask if I get a new gig.
Yeah.
And be like, and I take notes.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I'm about to have to deal with this.
Yeah.
Because I'm about to start working on legacy code, and I expect to see where the better developers have gone in and used the standard and the less than better have not.
Yeah. Well, you're also going to realize the magnitude of your own sins.
Yes.
Very soon.
Well, here's the thing. And this is really interesting because I'm going on to the maintenance team right as the project I started working on goes into pilot, like same day. Once it's in pilot, to make any changes, it has to go through the maintenance process.
Right.
So I'll be the one making changes to the app that I've been working on. I highly expect that most of what I do is going to be working on that.
Hey, just wanted to interrupt here and ask you guys to join us June 1st through 3rd for Music City Code, which is Nashville's hometown tech conference. Music City Code is packed with workshops, seminars, and panel discussions to inspire progress in Nashville's tech community. Music City Code will be held at Vanderbilt's Surratt Student Center Thursday, June 1st through Saturday, June 3rd. Ticket prices are half price through May 1st, and if you refer a sponsor, you get a free ticket. To learn more about Music City Code and register for the conference, visit musiccitycode.com. So the next one is what we call the do something already. And that's where you've got unnecessary or pointless code or a lot of like bootstrapping setup code to do every little thing you got to do.
Now, these are dispensable units of code that can be removed from the code base without hindering functionality.
Yeah, or removed or like trimmed down and put in a utility method somewhere.
Yeah, exactly. The absence of these creates cleaner and easier to understand code, and these do not have fixes as they just need to be removed.
I've got a chunk of code I'm working on where this guy goes through and sets all these things visible, right? They're visible by default.
Okay.
Well, if you delete that, you know what happens? Nothing. They're just there. And like this is a recurring pattern. And I think it's the guy's paranoid. He ran into some situation where stuff was not being visible. And so it's like leftover code that was boilerplate. And yeah, you just got to go find those things and remove them. And yeah, dead code especially, like you get a code cleanup tool or a linting tool or something like that. And you can actually find variables that aren't used, methods that aren't used, parameters to methods. Oh, wow. That's like one of the best things in the world to remove because you made everything easy for everybody. The less crap that's going in.
This is basically anything that's not being used anywhere in the app.
Yeah, because the compiler's removing it anyway, typically.
Yeah.
And so if it's in the app, it literally is nothing but noise.
And the problem I've noticed is when requirements change or corrections are made to the app and things get commented out.
Yeah, I delete commented code every time I see it.
Yeah. It's basically nobody took the time to remove the old code. The best way to deal with this, and what I've started doing, because, I'll be honest, when I first started, I was really bad about commenting out code and replacing it, and then going back and deleting it once I knew it worked.
Yeah, and I'll do that sometimes.
But that's all before it gets committed.
Right. Yeah, it should never get committed that way. And I'll tell you something else that'll burn you with comments. Let's say you've got 2 blocks of code that are commented out, and then you go, okay, this piece in the middle needs to be commented out, and a little bit on either side of those needs to be commented out. So you bulk select and and comment. Some of your commenting tools will not double comment the ones that were commented before, and so when you uncomment,
you uncomment everything,
right? And you pulled code in that you didn't know you pulled in.
Yep.
And it can also happen if you just over select or something along those lines.
I completely understand that. Really, if you're going to be working on something where you're going to comment out code, you need to branch it.
Yeah.
You create a feature branch, work on it, get it working, get it tested, in your own tests and stuff. Leave the commented code in the feature branch. If you have to keep that code, branch it. Leave it there.
Yeah.
And that way you can always go back to it.
Well, and it's also in your source control anyway.
Yeah, it's not in your code base, but it's in your source control.
Yeah, and it's really more of the thing of just get rid of noise.
Yeah.
Because noise confuses people.
Mm-hmm.
Now, also, this assumes that you have a decent source control system and a testing.
That's true. I'm kind of assuming that everybody is working at the same level I am.
Yeah.
And that may not be the case.
Yeah, we don't really have testing like automated like by computer. So
basically, delete the old code. If it's commented out for a reason, create a feature branch with the old code.
Yeah, I wish you could have a thing that would look at source control and actually do heuristics on a file and say this code is this rotten. In other words, like these comments have been here and it's been commented out for 6 months. That would be, and I don't think it would be that hard for somebody to build that. But man, I wish I had that because I would feel better about it. Because sometimes you'll delete stuff. It's like, oh yeah, I commented this out because hey, we're rolling this to dev and we're not entirely sure it's going to work, but I had to check it in to get it into the pipeline. Oops.
Yep. I know exactly what you mean. I've seen it.
I've deleted it.
I've done it.
Yeah.
And now I don't do it. It's one of those things that I realized was bad. Honestly, and this is the last thing I'm going to say on this, a good IDE, it's going to help you find dead code. Like, correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't it green squigglies in Visual Studio?
I don't know because I use Visual Studio with ReSharper and it makes it gray.
Well, I know it's a different color than an error.
Yeah.
And I think an error is red. A green is, hey, this isn't used anywhere else in the code.
That may be correct.
Yeah.
It's been a while since I've used
it. Because sometimes I'll declare variables and it'll turn green squiggly until I actually use those variables.
Yeah. Now, there are a couple places where you do want to keep dead variables that you're not actually using. In other words, they're being assigned but not used.
Yeah.
Exception handling blocks.
Oh, yeah.
For instance, you should have a logging framework that's actually using it, but let's say you don't because you're sloppy.
Yeah, well.
You'll do catch exception X or whatever, right? Mm-hmm. And then when you have an error that's coming up, you can set a breakpoint there and actually see the exception in the debug window. That's probably one of the few times that I would actually do that. But
fair enough. Completely fair.
It's a sign of a deeper pattern, a deeper problem anyway.
Yeah. And the point of code smells is they're quick, easy ways to see deeper problems.
Yeah, they're heuristics.
Yes.
Not diagnostics.
Exactly. Next is the redundancy again. Redundancy. And this is more than just duplication. It's when 2 classes or 2 methods do the same thing. They may not have the exact same code, but what they do is the same. It's easiest to find if they have duplicate code.
Yeah, if it's exactly the same. Although that can actually be pretty gnarly from a computational perspective if you got a big enough project.
Yeah.
Just because of all the string comparison stuff. But there's tools out there to do that. Mm-hmm. And if you see some code, one thing I've done a lot is if I think I've seen a piece of code before, I find like the jankiest, weirdest piece of it. And I select that and I Control Shift F and I go, okay, I'm going to find it in this solution. Mm-hmm. And then it'll tell me where those places are where that are kind of suspect and I can work from there.
This usually happens when multiple developers work on different areas within the same problem.
Yeah.
And they're unaware of each other's efforts to solve that problem. It can be more subtle when the code isn't duplicated, but the functionality is.
Right.
Like if they both find different Stack Overflow articles to follow.
Yes.
Or if one copy and paste from MSDN and one copy and paste from MDN.
Ah, yeah. Well, of course, you can tell the one that copied from MSDN because they have memory leaks.
Always.
Yeah, I swear, man.
Basically, with this, you need to dry out your wet code.
Yeah.
By dry, we mean don't repeat yourself. Combine the functionality when possible. Extract the code into a method you can call if it's within the same class. If it's two different classes, considering pulling out the code and creating a new class.
And that brings us kind of the next thing is speculative generality, which is a violation of the Yagni principle. I don't know if you're familiar with that. Yagni, you ain't going to need it.
Yeah.
And that's where you have unused classes, methods, parameters, because you think that something's going to need to call it in a certain way. And you went ahead and built it.
Yeah.
And it turns out nothing needs it.
Well, I have a quick story here. We had a senior developer that no longer works with us, but he couldn't agile for waterfall. He tried to predict where the app would go based on the stories in the backlog. Not the stories in his sprint that he was supposed to be doing, but he was trying to treat the backlog like it was a design document or technical specs that he was building to. And when this really came out was he was blaming the front-end developer for his API not working because she was a junior developer and basically saying, well, it's your fault because you don't know what you're doing.
Yeah.
And she came to me because she was completely confused and just could not ask him questions because he was being like that to her. And I looked at his code and I'm like, but that's not the object that you're sending. And she showed me the stories. I looked at their backlog and I'm like, yeah, he's not expecting that. What's happening is you're sending him what you're supposed to send him based on the story. And he's taking that and going, oh, if what I'm expecting to come in doesn't come in, let me take what you send me and create what I want out of it.
Yeah.
And it was because he was trying to predict what was coming down the pike based on the backlog stories.
Oh, man. Yeah. I've very seldom seen anybody that actually planned ahead legitimately well enough to deal with reality at a statistical level.
Yeah.
You might go, okay, yeah, I planned ahead for this and we're okay. And I wrote a bunch of extra code to do it. But most of the time, yeah, that's...
There's a difference between...
Like if you absolutely know something's coming.
Yeah, that too. But there's a difference between making your code to where you can build on it. Like there's a difference between the design of your code so that it can be added to and building for perceived features.
Right, especially when you don't know they're coming. I'll give you an example. I had a job at a company that dealt with a lot of media.
Yeah.
Okay. And so we could pull pictures in from, the file system. We could pull pictures in from pictures and videos and text and all this kind of stuff. You could pull it in from the file system. You could pull it in from email. You could pull it in from Twitter. You could pull it in from Facebook. Right. And instead of going, hey, I'm going to make a Facebook endpoint for the Facebook ones, I said, I'm going to make a generic thing that you inherit from that handles most of the functionality. Well, what happens? Well, stuff comes in from Twitter. The media is in completely different places. And so you're having to do all this branching code. And literally, I made a process that should have been 2 days. I made it 2 weeks and we had to throw the code away.
Well, what happened in the case that I was talking about? Senior dev gets fired. Junior API dev comes in and they asked her to look at it. She looked at the code and said it'd be easier if I just wrote it myself, rewrote it.
Yeah.
They come to me and say, hey, you were helping out the front-end dev here. What's your thoughts on this? If you had to come on to this project, what would you do? And I said the easiest thing to do would be to rewrite the code because it's completely useless what he wrote. And they're like, oh, well, that's what our other junior dev said. When two of you agree and say the exact same thing, all right, we're gonna go with that. We're gonna give her the time she needs to do that. And I gotta say, this particular junior dev, like they had failed 2 sprints.
Yeah.
2 weeks. She had them up and running.
Yeah.
That's how good she was. That's how good just doing what you were supposed to do was without doing the speculative generality. this is kind of a peeve of mine because like I saw my friends failing in what they were doing because of someone else not doing what they were supposed to do.
Well, and if you look at like just real world problems, like the way we planned out this podcast, it was, I won't say it was reactive. We were responsive. In other words, we didn't say, well, what happens when we get sponsors? Like that was not in the agenda on episode 1.
No.
Because, hey, you know, that's in the future. Like we have to get past right now. Mm-hmm. And had we done that, you know, it might have taken us a year just to get an episode out.
Well, yeah. I mean, your code needs to solve today's problems.
Yeah. Well, not, you know, it doesn't need to paint you into a corner for tomorrow's, but
that's true.
Most people, like, you would be surprised how hard it is to really paint yourself into a corner.
Yeah. I mean, leave yourself open to growth, but worry about tomorrow's problems when they arise. Because what you think is going to be a problem tomorrow may be solved by your framework, may not be a problem, maybe something that your product owner goes, you know what? I'm not worried about that. That's not something that our customers are ever going to do.
Or they might just shut the product down.
Yeah.
And then you probably stayed up late adding all this other crap, and you can't ever replace that time with your family either.
Yeah, exactly.
So another one that happens a lot is lazy in data classes, and basically a data class is a bag of state.
Yeah.
And it's equivalent to a record. Now, I do take a little issue with, like, it's one thing if it's okay, you have getter and setter properties for all the things. I don't like that very much. It's another thing when it's, hey, this is something that gets instantiated and it has, and it's immutable and it has just getters.
Yeah.
And it's here's a record here's a chunk of stuff and it was initialized. I don't like that pattern of, okay, other people put in and pull out and put in and pull out, because what you end up with is stuff can get in an inconsistent state, multiple threads, all that kind of stuff.
Here's my thing. So with the kind of web API MVC pattern that we're using, information comes in and I have a class that is basically a bunch of primitive data types, strings, integers.
And it represents the payload coming in.
Yes.
That's a message class, not a data class, which is what I'm describing. Now, a data class is where you go, oh, here's the people table in the database, and I'm going to make a class that just like totally wraps it, and they can read and write to it. And it's like, no, goob, don't do that.
So, what I have that comes in, and then it goes through some business logic, gets converted to a model class, which is what gets written to the database. Which I would assume that the model class is also a message class because it's the message that goes to the database.
Yeah, and it's just a payload crossing a boundary. And that's okay. What I don't like is the pattern where it's like, okay, we're going to pull up a record, and this record is going to live behind some interface, and we're going to write to different pieces of it and then save it. Mm-hmm. Because the way I look at that is, okay, there's some fields on there that you don't want to write on for that interface.
Okay, yeah.
And, like, for instance, in the web, right? Let's say I have a form and I post this thing and it corresponds exactly to the entity class that's going to be saved in the database. Okay. It has same properties, methods, and it's the full payload, right? Mm-hmm. But let's say it's a user record, and let's say we had a particularly dumb DBA that said, or a dumb person just in general that said, is admin. It's a Boolean property. We use it in the view, right? To say, are these things hidden or shown, right? But if it's a data class and they can write to that property and then that property goes back to the database, they are basically, all they have to do is add a form field and it gets serialized that way into the data class. It's a symptom of a larger problem, which is inadequate abstraction between what the data model is and what the things are you can do to it. Okay. Because it's like a bag of state is not valuable. It's a bag of state that's a result of stuff happening. And those things have to be defined. And I know I'm not describing that as well as I probably could.
What I'm thinking is, let's say you have some functionality that is restricted by level, like is admin kind of stuff. How would you do that?
Well, for one thing, that would be I would like to separate the read model from the write model in almost all cases. In other words, if I'm updating my profile, my user record, there's a payload that says update profile. Right? That comes in, it's got a certain set of fields, no more, no less. And then that gets applied to the data record that's going back to the database versus this payload goes all the way through the system. And typically what you see is when you see a bag of state that's the same as the table and it's the same as the UI, and it's used in both places. What that's doing is it's introducing coupling between the database and the front end.
Okay.
And so it's not that the thing is bad. It's that every tutorial that taught people how to do the bad thing did it this way all through the 90s. And those programmers are still around. There's a lot of that. We had a situation at work, and I am going to try not to put a negative spin on it, but there's a situation where you instead of you got a sequence of bills, right? Mm-hmm. And your balance rolls forward.
Yeah.
Well, in our system, a payment and a document are tied together intimately. And so as a result, you had previous documents that had a balance on them. Well, we obviously want to zero those out because the balance rolls, right?
Yeah.
Well, to display that in the UI, it's coming back as a decimal. And somebody goes, well, we can't put a blank in. We put a 0, but we can't put a blank. Why is that? Yeah. Well, it's because you used the data class and you tied those two things together. And the display model and the database model are not the same thing, but they use the data class. So it's like the data class it's an inflection point in the code where you can go, okay, this is getting used in a couple different places, and it's like a transit point for something being weird.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
What you're saying.
Lazy classes are another example of that as well. That's where the class doesn't have a whole lot of functionality left. Mm-hmm. You've pulled out other pieces, and so it's indicative of this thing is going away, but it hasn't gone away.
Yeah, well, it usually comes around through refactoring, where you could have pulled out parts to create single responsibility, and to the point where the class really doesn't do much at all.
Yeah.
Now, what you want to do in both of these cases is to reduce the code size by combining these with other classes. Move the data or features to another class that is using them. Collapse inheritance hierarchies if needed. Basically, just reduce the amount of code you have. And finally, under do something already is excessive use of comments.
Yes, like Microsoft's XML comments in C#. Holy crap. And like the guy that was there before me, I'm going to go off on a rant, right? Like you got a method that's got 15 parameters. Okay. So it's, method name, blah, blah, here's what it does. Parameter 1, this is parameter 1. Parameter 2, this is parameter 2. Parameter 3, this is parameter 3.
Okay, so on that,
I just about screamed when I found that.
The dev that I told you is no longer working for us, the senior dev, he stated, and this is almost an exact quote, I don't write documentation, it's in my comments.
Right.
And
because goodness knows everybody has access to source code. When
I looked at his code, each parameter had a comment.
Yeah.
So you have a class, you have a data class of getters and setters, or a message class of getters and setters. Each single one had an XML comment.
Yeah, and what I really love is it not only has an XML comment, but it has like sample code in the comment. You know how you can do that?
Yeah.
And so you got like a line of code and like 15 lines of comments above it.
Yeah.
And you're going, dude, you're just not trying to get anything done.
Yeah. Well, like, dude literally spent more time writing comments than code.
Yeah.
There's no question about that. Guys, basically, comments should explain the why, not the what.
Yeah, and I'm very light on comments. I get criticized for that a lot of times because I try to name variables in a way that's clear. I'll write documentation.
Yeah.
But the thing I don't want when I'm trying to go through code is to go through half a screen, go through a screen that's like half comments, because now I can't see two things together and I got to split my window or do some other crap to see two pieces that are related.
There's a couple places I'll use comments. I'll use the XML comments that you're talking about, the Visual Studio stuff, in
publicly facing classes.
Yes, publicly facing classes.
If you're making an API, it makes total sense because that's an artifact of your build.
Yes, exactly. There, or in places like I had to write some very complex algorithms for some graphical, not graphical, but for some geographical code, and the conversions just use some really heavy math. And so I put a lot of comments in there just to say what I was doing at what point.
Right.
Because it was two parts. One, it was really complex math. Two, I was taking a VB, pre.NET VB.
Yeah.
Like VB6 code, converting it to C#.net. So I wanted anyone that looked at what I was doing to be able to understand exactly what was going on.
Right.
Because it took me about 2 or 3 weeks to figure that out. And like conversations with our GIS expert, conversations with mathematicians, like it took a long time for me to work this out and figure out what it was doing to write these conversions, basically. And I don't want someone coming in that needs to fix something or add a feature or something like that in the future to have to go through all of that.
Right.
And in that place, a lot of comments make sense.
The other place I'll use them, is where I'm having to do optimizations that don't seem particularly obvious.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of, I get into some low level stuff and things like dealing with, especially if it's dealing with a Windows API or anything like that, where it's like, okay, I have a device context. I've got to dispose this thing.
Yeah.
And them understanding, why I'm having to call this method, because what people will say is, oh, what does this do? And some of those methods are not, if you don't understand how the graphics subsystems work, they're not completely clear.
Yeah.
And so I'll do it for stuff like that, or stuff where I know that other members of the team don't, they don't have their head wrapped around certain things. Like I've got some expression tree code in Delphi and .NET both, which is a thing for another day, but like laying out what's actually going on. And hey, I know you think that this casting operator is the same as this one, but don't do that because this will break things like 1,000 lines down.
Now, to close this section out, I have a quote from sourcemaking.com, which is where I got a lot of this. One of the main resources I used, and it says, comments are like deodorant masking the smell of fishy code.
I would agree with that.
And I couldn't put it any better way than that, so I just had to quote them directly from that.
Yeah, or putting lipstick on a pig.
Yeah, well, there's that too.
There's the other way to put it.
Yeah.
In the last section of those that we listed, because there's so many that you could actually list here, is bloated or too much useful code. It's called different things, depending on where you are. Usually bloated is the term that's used. A lot.
These are
which reminds you of a dead fish. So that's what they call it. It's code smells, right?
These are classes or methods that have grown to such a large size that they're difficult to understand and difficult to work with. The smells here aren't the most obvious at first, as they tend to grow over time.
Well, they're not obvious to you as a senior developer that's continually working on it. When a novice comes in, it's like a smell in your house, right? Like you live in, like if you live in filth, you're used to it. But when a guest comes over, whoo,
Yeah.
So, and that's what happens here. It's something that's built up over time. I tend to be a little reluctant to let a method actually get longer than a screen, if that makes sense, as far as height, because then I can't see the whole thing and conceptualize it in my head.
And we're going to talk about that in just a minute when we talk about long methods. But
yeah.
You'll find these more in older code bases than newer ones.
Yeah. And some of that too is the language's expressiveness.
Yeah, that's true. The language, and also it's a lot easier to add code than to read and understand it.
Yeah.
And you get a lot of, all right, well, this is only one more line or two more lines of code.
And then I can go to lunch.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
So the first one here is the God class. These are classes with way too much code or too much control. These classes generally start off small, but over time, they tend to grow out of control, and more accurately, they grow to control everything.
You'll see this with utility classes a lot.
Yeah.
More than anything. Or where, it starts out as a utility class and somebody goes, wouldn't it be great if this thing could control flow from some other part of the application? Like I pitch stuff in and stuff goes into it and then out. And then somebody goes, oh, but now if I send something back, it's going to have to return to the caller. So this thing has to be smart enough to send it back and know, oh, well, if I get this, I got to go over here. Yeah. And it ends up being the place where the spaghetti code goes to die.
Yeah.
Except it doesn't actually die. Yeah.
These tend to break the single responsibility principle of object-oriented programming. To get around this, you got to split up the responsibility of these classes to allow for more readable code. Developers don't have to remember a lot of attributes for a single class when you do that. And this also helps to avoid duplication of code within the larger class.
Yeah, because if you have a God class, once it gets big enough, people don't go, hey, is this already here? Because the other thing that you're exposed to in that situation is, okay, I could call this other thing, but then my code's going to break if some goober on the third floor comes in and changes this other method or something it depends on.
Yeah.
And, it's going to bubble up to you, and you're going to be the one that has to come back in here and deal with it.
Mm-hmm.
So it's sort of like it's like a storage closet for stuff, right? Like everybody, you get a closet that's full enough, how it's like, oh, I've got a spare, extension cable. I'm going to open that door and throw it in real hard and slam the door instead of dealing with it. Like that's what a God class is basically a junk storage closet. And what happens? Well, sometime later, somebody opens the door and all the stuff falls out.
Mm-hmm.
And so you don't want to be that guy.
Yeah. Because it gets blamed on you when everything falls out and makes a mess.
Yeah.
Next is long methods with too many lines of code. And like Will stated, he prefers to keep his methods within the same page. A good rule of thumb is to make them no more than 10 lines. Yeah. If it's more than that, start looking to break it up.
Yeah. That if it gets over that tends to be an indication of either there's too much ceremony to initialize stuff. The method has too many responsibilities, or it's too complex. In other words, like it's doing conditional logic, too many layers of it.
And again, these are smells.
Yeah.
So sometimes you may have methods that you just can't break up because what it's doing is it's not that it's using conditionals to be complex. It's complex because
it's complex.
Yeah, you're doing higher order math and you just need that.
And you need it to be fast so you don't be passing to subroutines.
Yes.
The other thing that'll get you on this too is if you're using a language like, T-SQL, like a stored procedure. Yeah. It's like, okay, well, this proc, I don't want it to be long, but if I don't make it long, I've got to allocate a temporary table and I've got to do all this other stuff and make other things I'm going to call and deal with errors bubbling up and their error handling's kind of poo. And, so you kind of got to adjust this based on language. Other languages like C#, 10 lines, in a lot of cases, you should be able to get away with it. Because you can use link and you've got all these other things that are intended to shorten the code anyway. But you may be doing 50,000 lines worth of computation in that method.
Yeah, that's very true. And like the God classes, these tend to grow over time. It's easier to write code than to read it.
Yeah.
I'm just going to say that one more time. It's easier to write code than it is to read it. There's a mentality that it's harder to create a new method than it is to add to a current method.
Yeah. In some cases, that's right, because you also got to update a header file. You've got to update a public interface. You got to write documentation. You got to do all that.
Yeah.
But even so, dude, no, don't, go ahead and bite the bullet and do it right.
Yeah. Well, you do it right once the first time. You're not having to come in and fix it multiple times. So for these, extract out the code in the method that does its own thing and create a new method. Shorter methods and functions are easier to understand and they last longer.
Yeah.
People aren't going to mess with your method if it's short and does what it's supposed to do.
Right. They're only going to mess with it if it's long. The other thing that happens is you get a lot of duplication if you have a long method because people, the stuff is up at the top. They don't want to make a new method. And so they just, they copy paste and make some changes. Like eventually that starts happening.
And finally, we have long parameter lists. These are too many parameters that are passed into a method. Generally, you want to keep it to 3 to 4 parameters at a max. And this can kind of come about in several ways. Sometimes you'll have several algorithms that were merged into a single method. Or it could come about through the byproduct of making classes more independent.
Right, because you got to pass that whole wad of classes in to have context.
Yes.
Which typically what I like to do is make a context object that I stuff all that into and then pitch it in. That way, when I have to add another one, I don't have to change method signatures.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Instead of a long list of parameters, pass in an object that'll have all the parameters within it. You got to be careful, though, when fixing this so that you don't create a bunch of temporary fields. that we mentioned before.
Right. And the other thing you have to do is validate input. Because when you add, like let's say you add a property and your method needs it, or you add something else on that bucket of stuff, you need to check, make sure it's there.
Exactly.
Because somebody else that's calling it or existing code that's calling it will get an error.
Yeah.
And you really want to say, hey, this is required now. Either that or do a null object pattern.
Yeah, that's true. Some research done by Tufano et al. Found that there is empirical evidence for the consequence of technical debt, but only anecdotal evidence as to how, when, or why this occurs. Code smells provide a quick and easy way for even junior developers to review their code and find areas where they can improve or reduce the overall technical debt. That pretty much wraps us up. Before we close everything out, Will, what do you have for us this week for Tricks of the Trade?
I want to talk about revealing too much detail, but not in a technical sense, or not directly in a technical sense. For instance, if you're talking to your manager and your manager's not a coder, they don't necessarily care how you implement things. And you should be aware of that particular boundary versus going into minute detail. And the reason you should do that, one, it makes it kind of wastes the manager's time, and typically they feel like they have to be polite, and so they're stuck listening to you. But the real thing it does is it also makes you look like you're not confident, and you're throwing more and more data at the thing to try to overwhelm it versus going, yeah, here's what we're going to do, and then go on with life. So I want to throw that out there as something to bear in mind when you're giving too much detail, because sometimes it can really backfire on you. That's all I got.
Stand by for Titanfall.
If you have a question or comment for us, please email us at neckbeards@completedeveloperpodcast.com. Our theme music is an excerpt from Stand By for Titanfall by Pure Bells, available on SoundCloud and licensed under Creative Commons. The intro music for IoTs is Hillbilly Hip Hop by Jason Belcher. For references, show notes, and to sign up to our email list, be sure and check out the website at CompleteDeveloperPodcast.com. You can also follow us on Twitter at CompleteDevPod and like our page on Facebook to keep up with the news about the show. Thanks for listening. See you next time.